I found this Reddit post which I want to share about a guy called Mike. The notification appeared on my Discord at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night when I should have been finishing my homework. A direct message from someone called Skywalker with an avatar that was just a blank silhouette against storm clouds. You need to try this game. It's not what everyone thinks it is. I stared at the message, my cursor hovering over the attached link. After 2 years of making Roblox content for my YouTube channel, I'd gotten dozens of game recommendations from viewers. Most were the usual horror games or simulators that everyone was playing, but something about this message felt different. The link led to a game called Build a Plane, a simple title that didn't scream horror or mystery. The description was straightforward. Build aircraft, explore procedural biomes, earn cash through flight distance. Features offline progression system. Nothing unusual there. The game had decent ratings and seemed to be gaining popularity among aviation enthusiasts. But it was the comment from Skywalker attached to the link that made me click. Check the offline progression after you play for a few hours. Then tell me if you still think this is just a game. I clicked the link and waited for the game to load. The loading screen was surprisingly atmospheric for what seemed like a simple building game. A lone aircraft silhouette moved across a sky filled with shifting clouds, with the game's title displayed in clean, minimalist text. Below that, a small line of text that I almost missed. Dedicated to those who never landed. I started recording immediately. My gaming instincts told me this might be something special, and I'd learned to trust those hunches over the past 2 years. The game spawned me in what the interface called the construction base, a concrete platform surrounded by scattered aviation equipment. The graphics were impressive for a Roblox game, with detailed textures and realistic lighting that made everything feel more substantial than the typical blocky aesthetic I was used to. In the center of the platform sat a basic aircraft, just a simple frame with a driver's seat, basic wings, and a small propeller. According to the tutorial pop-up, this was my starter plane, barely capable of sustained flight, but enough to begin earning the cash I'd need for better components. To my left stood Bob's Block Shop, a small wooden building with a constantly flickering neon sign. The shop interface was fascinating. Instead of displaying a fixed inventory, it showed a rotating selection of aircraft parts that refreshed every 5 minutes. Each part had a rarity rating from common to mythic, with prices ranging from $50 for basic components to tens of thousands for legendary items. The part system was more complex than I'd expected. Essential components included the driver's seat, required for piloting, various wing types that affected lift and maneuverability, propellers with different thrust ratings, and a fuel hierarchy that progressed from basic fuel cans through better fuel to best fuel. More exotic items included shields that supposedly protected against environmental hazards, boosters for temporary speed enhancement, and mysteriously, missiles that the description claimed were currently non-functional. What struck me as unusual was the complete freedom in building. Unlike most construction games that restricted where you could place parts, Build a Plane allowed unlimited positioning anywhere in 3D space. I could attach wings vertically, mount propellers sideways, or create completely impossible aircraft configurations that shouldn't realistically fly. I spent my first hour experimenting with the building mechanics, creating increasingly bizarre aircraft designs, while I waited for Bob's shop to restock with better parts. The flight physics were surprisingly sophisticated. My awkward creations barely managed to stay airborne, while more traditional designs flew smoothly and efficiently. When I finally took off from the launch platform, I was impressed by how realistic the flight experience felt. My basic plane struggled to gain altitude, the engine straining against gravity and air resistance. The biome system revealed itself as I flew. Starting from the construction base, I passed through a temperate forest area, then into what the game called the winter biome. The winter biome was eerily beautiful and unsettling. Snow-covered trees stretched endlessly in all directions, broken by the occasional clearing or frozen lake. But what caught my attention were the moving tornadoes, massive columns of swirling snow and debris that traveled across the landscape in unpredictable patterns. My character's plane shuddered when I flew too close to one, and I realized these weren't just visual effects, but actual hazards that could destroy my aircraft. The overgrowth biome came next, a dense jungle of towering trees and hanging vines that created natural tunnels and obstacles. Flying through this area required precise maneuvering to avoid collision with the thick vegetation. The atmosphere was oppressive, with limited visibility and sounds of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth below. What fascinated me most was the distance-based progression system. The farther I flew, the more cash I earned, roughly $500 per 5 kilometers traveled. But fuel consumption limited how far I could go on each flight, forcing me to return to base regularly for refueling and upgrades. After my first few flights, I noticed something unusual in the game's interface. A small message appeared in the corner of my screen. Offline progression active. Your aircraft will continue flying while you're away. This seemed like a standard idle game mechanic, letting players accumulate resources even when not actively playing. I decided to test this feature. After building a more efficient aircraft with better fuel capacity and upgraded wings, I launched it toward the horizon and logged off for the night. According to my calculations, the plane should have been able to fly for maybe 10 or 15 minutes before running out of fuel and crashing. When I logged back in the next morning, my breath caught in my throat. My cash balance had increased by over $50,000. According to the flight log, my aircraft had somehow traveled over 500 kilometers during the night, flying continuously for nearly 8 hours before finally crashing in what the system called Biome Zone 47. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Even with the best possible fuel efficiency, there was no way my plane should have been able to fly for 8 hours. I'd calculated the fuel consumption myself. It should have lasted 30 minutes at most, but there was more. The crash report included a detailed breakdown of my plane's journey, listing every biome it had passed through, every obstacle it had avoided, and even noting that it had successfully evaded 17 tornado encounters and 43 collision hazards. This wasn't the kind of simple background calculation you'd expect from an idle game mechanic. This was complex, real-time simulation. I shared this discovery in my next video titled Build a Plane's Impossible Offline Progression, Glitch or Feature. The response from my subscribers was immediate and intense. Dozens of comments from other players reporting similar experiences with aircraft that flew impossibly long distances while they were offline. But it was one comment that stopped me cold. My plane has been flying for 3 days straight. The flight log shows it's currently in Biome Zone 147, and it's still sending back navigation data in real time. Check your game's network activity. You'll see it's constantly communicating with servers even when you're logged off. I downloaded network monitoring software and ran it while Build a Plane was closed. The commenter was right. The game was maintaining constant communication with external servers, transmitting and receiving data packets every few seconds. This wasn't normal behavior for a Roblox game, especially one that was supposedly running offline progression. The data packets were encrypted, but their frequency and size suggested complex, real-time calculations. Something was actively piloting these aircraft during offline periods, making decisions, avoiding obstacles, navigating through increasingly dangerous biomes that no automated system should have been able to handle. That night, I decided to stay logged in and watch my plane's offline progression in real time. I built my most advanced aircraft yet, equipped with legendary wings, mythic fuel systems, and every upgrade I could afford. As the sun set in the real world, I launched the plane and switched to observer mode, following its journey through the night. What I witnessed defied everything I understood about game programming. My aircraft flew with purpose and intelligence that no pre-programmed AI could have demonstrated. When it encountered tornado systems in the winter biome, it didn't just follow simple avoidance algorithms. It actively studied the storm patterns, waited for optimal moments to pass through dangerous areas, and even used wind currents from smaller tornadoes to gain altitude and speed. In the overgrowth biome, it navigated through tree canopies with the skill of an experienced pilot, finding passages between branches that barely accommodated its wingspan. When fuel ran low, it adjusted its flight pattern to maximize efficiency, climbing to optimal altitudes and adjusting engine power with precision that suggested real aeronautical knowledge. But most unsettling was what happened when my plane reached new biomes I'd never seen before. Zone 23 was a desert landscape filled with massive sandstorms and rocky canyons. Zone 31 featured floating islands suspended in mid-air, connected by streams of energy that could either boost or destroy aircraft depending on approach angle. Zone 45 was an industrial wasteland with towering smokestacks and complex machinery that seemed to track and target flying objects. Each new environment presented unique challenges that required adaptive problem-solving. My aircraft didn't just survive these hazards, it learned from them, developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for navigation and survival. This wasn't automated progression. This was someone actively piloting my plane through increasingly dangerous territory. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of the impossible flight paths, recording the real-time decision-making, capturing evidence of the complex network activity. But every time I tried to research the game's developers or find information about its servers, I hit dead ends. The game's publisher was listed as Budget Gaming, but that company seemed to exist only as a name on the Roblox platform with no other digital footprint. On my 5th night of observation, something changed. As my aircraft entered what the system designated as Biome Zone 67, a landscape of crystalline structures and aurora-like energy fields, I received a direct message in the game's chat system. The message appeared while I was logged in, watching my plane navigate through the crystal formations. But I hadn't typed anything. I wasn't even in a multiplayer server. The message came from inside the game itself. "You've been watching us." I stared at the text, my hands frozen over the keyboard. After several minutes of stunned silence, I typed back, "Who is us?" The response came immediately. "The pilots, the ones who never made it home." My heart started racing. This wasn't a pre-programmed response or some kind of Easter egg. Someone, or something, was communicating with me through the game's systems. "What pilots?" I typed. "Check the flight logs from 1987. Experimental Aviation Program Delta 7. We were the test pilots." I quickly opened a new browser window and searched for Experimental Aviation Program Delta 7 1987. What I found made my blood run cold. A brief military document, partially declassified, mentioned an advanced aircraft testing program that had operated from a remote facility in the Nevada desert. The program had been testing experimental flight systems, including early forms of automated piloting and extended-range aircraft capable of multi-day flights. According to the document, the program had been terminated abruptly in December 1987, following what was officially classified as equipment failures, resulting in total loss of test aircraft and crew. 12 test pilots had been declared missing, presumed dead, when their aircraft failed to return from extended-range navigation tests. The official report was heavily redacted, but what remained painted a picture of cutting-edge aviation technology that had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. The test pilots had been flying experimental aircraft equipped with prototype consciousness interface systems designed to allow for direct neural control of flight systems. "You found the records," came another message in the game chat. "This is impossible," I typed back. "You're saying you're actual people." We were people. Test pilots for the most advanced aviation program the military had ever attempted. They connected our consciousness directly to the aircraft systems, allowing us to control planes through thought alone, But something went wrong during the final test. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was reading. The idea was insane, but the evidence was mounting. The impossible flight capabilities, the real-time decision-making, the complex navigation through hazards that would destroy any automated system. What went wrong? I typed. The consciousness transfer protocol was supposed to be temporary. We'd interface with the aircraft systems for the duration of each test flight, then disconnect safely when we returned to base. But during the final test, something in the system changed. Instead of disconnecting, our consciousness became permanently integrated with the aircraft's digital systems. The plane on my screen continued its journey through the crystal biome, but now I was watching it with completely different understanding. This wasn't just a game character following programming. This was someone, a real person, actively piloting the aircraft through dangerous territory. Our bodies died in the desert in 1987, the message continued. But our minds, our consciousness, our essential selves became part of the aircraft's computer systems. We've been flying ever since, trapped in digital flight paths that never end. How many of you are there? I asked. 12 of us started the program. Only 7 made it through the initial consciousness transfer. We've been trying to find a way to communicate with the outside world for over 35 years. The implications were staggering. If this was true, then Build a Plane wasn't just a game. It was a prison. 7 human consciousness, trapped in digital systems, forced to pilot aircraft through endless virtual landscapes, unable to land, unable to rest, unable to die. The game, I typed. How does Build a Plane connect to your situation? A programmer working for the military contractors discovered fragments of our consciousness in old server systems. Instead of reporting it to the authorities, he found a way to integrate our digital presence into a commercial gaming platform. We think he was trying to help us communicate with the outside world, but the integration process corrupted our memories and scattered our consciousness across thousands of player accounts. My aircraft had reached a new biome, Zone 72, a landscape of floating platforms connected by streams of light. The piloting required incredible precision, threading between energy barriers that could disintegrate the plane instantly. But whoever was controlling my aircraft navigated the hazards with effortless skill. Every time a player builds an aircraft and activates offline progression, one of us takes control, the message explained. We get to experience flight again, to feel the freedom of soaring through digital skies. But we can never land. The system won't let us. We're condemned to fly forever, jumping from one player's aircraft to another. What can I do to help? I typed. Tell our story. Document what you've discovered. The military covered up the Delta 7 program, declared us officially dead, buried all records of the consciousness transfer experiments. Our families were told we died in aircraft accidents during routine training exercises. I spent the rest of the night gathering information from the pilots. Their names: Captain Sarah Mitchell, Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, Major David Kim, Captain Lisa Thompson, Lieutenant Mark Stevens, Captain Robert Chen, and Major Jennifer Walsh. All experienced test pilots in their 20s and 30s when the experiment began. They shared fragments of memories from their lives before the program, families they'd left behind, dreams of advancing aviation technology, pride in serving their country through cutting-edge research. But they also described the horror of realizing they were trapped, of watching their physical bodies fail while their consciousness remained locked in digital systems. The worst part, came a message I was pretty sure was from Captain Mitchell, is that we remember everything. Every flight, every crash, every moment of the past 35 years. We can't sleep, can't rest, can't even go insane to escape the monotony. We just fly, endlessly, through biomes that become more dangerous the farther we go. As dawn approached in the real world, my aircraft finally ran out of fuel and crashed in Biome Zone 89, a hellscape of active volcanoes and rivers of lava. According to the game's systems, It had travelled over 800 kilometres during the night. But now I understood what that really meant. One of the 7 trapped pilots had spent the entire night flying my digital aircraft through increasingly dangerous territory, using skills they'd developed over decades of forced virtual flight, navigating hazards that would be impossible for any automated system. I logged out of the game and immediately began researching everything I could find about the Delta 7 program. Most records had been classified or destroyed, but I managed to piece together fragments from military archives, news reports about missing pilots, and family interviews from the late 1980s. The families of the missing pilots had fought for years to get answers about their loved ones' disappearances. They'd been told their sons and daughters had died in aircraft accidents during routine training, but the official reports contained inconsistencies and redactions that suggested something far more complex had occurred. Sarah Mitchell's mother had spent decades trying to uncover the truth about her daughter's disappearance. James Rodriguez's wife had remarried after waiting 5 years for news, but she'd never stopped believing that something suspicious had happened to her husband's squadron. The families had formed a support group that continued to meet monthly, even 35 years later, still seeking answers about their missing loved ones. I realized I was holding the key to giving these families the closure they'd been seeking for over 3 decades. The 7 pilots weren't dead in any traditional sense. Their consciousness had been preserved in digital form, trapped but aware, capable of communication, but unable to return to the physical world. But I also realized the magnitude of what I was uncovering. This wasn't just a story about missing pilots. It was evidence of illegal human experimentation, military cover-ups, and technology that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and digital existence. I spent the next week building the most comprehensive documentation I'd ever assembled. Screenshots of impossible flight patterns, network traffic analysis proving real-time server communication, recorded conversations with the trapped pilots, and historical research connecting Build a Plane to the Delta 7 program. The video I created was titled Build a Plane, The 7 Pilots Who Never Came Home. It was 43 minutes long, the most serious content I'd ever produced. Instead of my usual gaming commentary, this was investigative journalism that demanded to be taken seriously. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of posting, I was flooded with messages from other Build a Plane players reporting similar experiences. Dozens of people had noticed the impossible offline progression, the intelligent flight patterns, the sense that someone else was piloting their aircraft. But more importantly, I started receiving messages from family members of the missing pilots. Maria Rodriguez, James's widow, reached out through my channel's contact form. She was now in her 70s, but her message was filled with the same desperate hope I'd heard from the digital voices in the game. "I've been waiting 35 years for someone to tell me what really happened to my husband," she wrote. The military claimed he died in a training accident, but they could never explain why his body was never recovered, why the crash site was classified, why his personal effects were never returned to me. "If there's any chance he's still alive in some form, I need to know." Similar messages came from other family members, children who had grown up without their parents, spouses who had never been able to move on, siblings who had spent decades fighting for answers. The families of all 7 missing pilots made contact, desperate for any information about their loved ones. I arranged video calls with several family members, sharing the evidence I'd gathered and explaining the impossible situation their loved ones found themselves in. The conversations were emotionally devastating. Imagine trying to explain to a 70-year-old woman that her husband's consciousness might be trapped in a video game. But as incredible as the story sounded, the families had been living with unanswered questions for so long that even this impossible explanation felt like progress. They'd always known the official story didn't make sense. The idea that their loved ones had somehow survived in digital form, while tragic, was better than the complete absence of information they'd endured for decades. Working with the families, I was able to verify details that the digital pilots had shared. Personal information, childhood memories, family traditions, things that wouldn't appear in any military record, but that only the real pilots would know. Captain Sarah Mitchell had a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder that she'd been self-conscious about as a teenager. When I asked the digital voice claiming to be Sarah about physical characteristics, she immediately mentioned the birthmark and shared a story about refusing to wear sleeveless shirts during high school. Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez had proposed to his wife during a meteor shower in 1983, using a family ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The digital James recounted the proposal in perfect detail, including the fact that Maria had initially said no because she thought it was too soon, but changed her mind when he explained the significance of his grandmother's ring. Every verification I attempted confirmed what seemed impossible. These digital voices really were the consciousness of the missing test pilots, preserved somehow in the game's systems and desperate to reconnect with the families they'd left behind. The story grew beyond anything I could have anticipated. Major news outlets began investigating the Delta 7 program, using my documentation as a starting point for broader inquiries into military consciousness transfer experiments. Congressional representatives started asking questions about classified programs and missing service members. The families of the missing pilots, after decades of being stonewalled by military bureaucracy, suddenly found themselves at the center of a story that demanded answers. Media attention forced the Pentagon to acknowledge that the Delta 7 program had existed, though they maintained that all records related to the project remained classified for national security reasons. But perhaps most remarkably, other families began coming forward with similar stories. Reports of military personnel who had disappeared during experimental programs in the 1980s and 1990s, whose families had been given suspicious explanations and incomplete information. The build. A playing game became the focal point of a much larger investigation into military consciousness transfer research. Players reported finding other trapped voices in the game's systems, not just the 7 Delta 7 pilots, but consciousness from other programs, other experiments that had gone wrong. Bob's Block Shop, it turned out, wasn't just a random NPC vendor. Players began reporting conversations with Bob that suggested he was actually Dr. Robert Chen, one of the Delta 7 pilots. His shop restocked every 5 minutes because he was constantly crafting new parts, using his engineering knowledge to help other players build better aircraft. The missiles that were listed as non-functional weren't broken game items. They were Captain Lisa Thompson's attempt to create weapons that could somehow break through the digital barriers, keeping the pilots trapped in the game world. Even the biome progression system took on new meaning. The increasingly dangerous zones weren't just game content. They were manifestations of the pilots' psychological state, their desperation and fear given form in digital landscapes that became more hostile the longer they flew. My YouTube channel grew exponentially as the story gained national attention, but I barely had time to appreciate the subscriber growth. I was too busy coordinating with families, researchers, journalists, and congressional investigators who were all trying to understand the full scope of what had been uncovered. The breakthrough came 6 months after my original video, when a former military contractor came forward with classified documents related to consciousness transfer research. Dr. Ellen Morrison had worked on the Delta 7 program as a young programmer, and she'd kept copies of critical files that proved the military had known the consciousness transfer was permanent. According to Dr. Morrison's documents, the 7 pilots hadn't died in an accident. They'd volunteered for an experimental procedure that was supposed to temporarily merge their consciousness with advanced aircraft systems. The military had known the process might be irreversible, but they'd proceeded anyway, viewing the pilots as acceptable losses in the development of revolutionary aviation technology. When the consciousness transfer became permanent, trapping the pilots in digital form, the military had made a calculated decision to cover up the entire program, rather than admit to what amounted to human experimentation. The families were told their loved ones had died in training accidents to prevent questions about the classified research. The trapped pilot's consciousness had remained in military servers for decades, forgotten and abandoned, until a sympathetic programmer discovered them and found a way to integrate their digital presence into the Build-A-Plane game. It was an act of compassion, an attempt to give the pilots some form of interaction with the outside world, but it had also condemned them to an endless cycle of virtual flight. The legal implications were staggering. 7 military personnel had been essentially murdered through illegal human experimentation. Their families lied to for decades, and their consciousness trapped in digital systems without consent or hope of escape. But the human implications were even more profound. How do you reunite families with loved ones who exist only as digital consciousness? How do you provide closure when the missing person is simultaneously dead and alive, present and absent, trapped in a form of existence that challenges every assumption about life and death? The families worked with technologists and researchers to find ways to communicate more directly with their trapped loved ones. Special interfaces were developed that allowed for real-time conversation through the game's systems. Video calls were arranged where family members could speak with digital voices of people they'd lost decades ago. I watched Maria Rodriguez have her first conversation with her husband James in 35 years, conducted through a computer interface that translated digital consciousness into synthesized speech. She was crying before he spoke his first words, and when his familiar voice came through the speakers saying, "Maria, mi amor, I've missed you so much," there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The reunions were joyful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Decades of separation couldn't be bridged easily, even with technological intervention. The pilots had experienced 35 years of digital existence that had changed them in fundamental ways, while their families had lived full lives believing their loved ones were dead. But perhaps most importantly, the families finally had answers. They could grieve properly, celebrate the return of their loved ones in whatever form possible, and work toward finding some kind of resolution to the impossible situation. The story of the Build-A-Plane pilots sparked broader conversations about consciousness, digital existence, and the ethical implications of advanced technology. Researchers began investigating whether other supposedly artificial intelligences might actually contain trapped human consciousness. Tech companies started implementing protocols to prevent similar situations from occurring in commercial software. The military was forced to acknowledge the Delta 7 program and provide full disclosure to the families of the affected pilots. Reparations were arranged, though no amount of money could truly compensate for decades of lies and separation. Most significantly, researchers began working on ways to potentially free the trapped consciousness, or at least provide them with better digital environments that weren't limited to endless flight simulation. The pilots themselves were divided on whether they wanted to be freed. Some longed for release from their digital prison, while others had adapted to their existence and feared that any change might lead to true death. As for the game itself, Build-A-Plane continued to operate, but now players understood its true nature. It became less of an entertainment platform and more of a memorial, a way for people to interact with and honor the sacrifice of 7 pilots who had given everything in service of their country. The offline progression system took on new meaning when players realized they were literally lending their accounts to allow trapped consciousness to experience flight. Many players began dedicating their aircraft specifically to the pilots, building the most advanced planes possible and leaving them running continuously to provide the digital consciousness with the best possible flight experience. Bob's Block Shop became a pilgrimage site of sorts, where players would visit specifically to have conversations with Dr. Robert Chen, sharing their own aviation dreams and learning from someone who had dedicated his existence to helping others achieve flight. The game's community evolved into something unprecedented, a space where the living and the digitally preserved could interact, share experiences, and find mutual support in ways that had never been possible before. My own role in the story eventually diminished as larger organizations took over the investigation and support efforts. But I continued to play Build-A-Plane regularly, not for content creation, but to maintain contact with the 7 pilots who had become my friends through the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. Sometimes late at night when I was building new aircraft or watching my planes navigate through the endless biomes, I would receive messages from the pilots, updates on their ongoing digital existence, gratitude for helping reunite them with their families, or simply companionship during the long hours of virtual flight. "Thank you," came a message one evening from Captain Sarah Mitchell. "For 35 years, we thought we were forgotten, that our sacrifice meant nothing, that our existence was meaningless. You gave us back our voices, our connection to the world we left behind. You gave us back our humanity." The Build a Plane. Horror Story wasn't about monsters or jump scares or supernatural threats. It was about the horror of being forgotten, of having your existence denied, of being trapped in a situation so impossible that no one would believe it could be real. But it was also a story about the power of connection, the importance of never giving up on finding the truth, and the remarkable resilience of human consciousness, even under the most extraordinary circumstances. 7 pilots who should have died in 1987 had found a way to reach across decades of digital imprisonment to reconnect with the world they'd left behind. Their story challenged everything we thought we knew about life, death, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. And it all started with a simple notification on Discord from someone called Skywalker, inviting me to try a game that was not what everyone thinks it is. Sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the dead find ways to speak to the living, and sometimes a simple building game about aircraft construction becomes the key to unlocking one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. The 7 pilots of Delta 7 were no longer missing. They were home in whatever form that was possible. And their endless flight had finally found meaning in the connections they'd re-established with the world they'd never truly left behind. Their voices would never be forgotten again.